welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to read off my phone just an introduction to the day and some thank yous, if you don't mind. A convening for Virgil Abloh is a one-day symposium celebrating the life, legacy, and practice of our dear friend, Virgil, one of the foremost designers and creative talents of our generation. Though his output assumed many forms, his approach was very much grounded in a design sensibility, honed through decades of obsessive study, both self-guided and formal. Today is an occasion to reflect on his work as a designer. Across 6 talks, each one will focus on a specific discipline that he worked in. Ours is going to focus on conceptual art, but for the rest of the day, you'll hear amazing people speaking to his legacy in architecture, in music, in graffiti, and in material culture. And to contextualize where we are today, the dialogues are set against a site-specific installation by the artist Theaster Gates that we specially commissioned and that he dedicated to V. Gates invokes sacred spaces in his use of the church pews that you all are sitting on. And on the surrounding walls, Gates mounts 2 new iterations in his civil tapestry painting series, integrating Virgil's iconography as a tribute to his life and work. The intent was to create a contemplative space foregrounding V throughout the fair's programming this week. Before we begin, I just want to express our sincerest thanks to everyone who worked on this, to Theaster and to his studio for their generosity and efforts in putting the space together. To the entire team at Design Miami, we're so grateful to all of you for your partnership in this. Thank you so much. To our family at Nike for their support in so many of the activities that are happening this week in celebration of V. And last but not least, to Shannon Abloh, Virgil's wife, partner, president of Virgil Abloh Foundation. Thank you so much for your support, as always. So we'll kick this off. Today, I'm sitting with Ebony L. Haynes, senior director and curator at 52 Walker, and David Zwerner, and sitting with Mahfuz Sultan, director of clocks and architecture, Cara Virgil Abloh. We're all really good friends, so we'll try to keep it formal, not too casual.
It's going to be pretty casual.
But yeah, let's keep it casual. Let's tell like inside stories. I wanted to kick this off. This is a slide from Virgil's lecture at Harvard GSD in 2017. And I feel like it still stands as such a manifesto for how he thought about his work, even where we are today, 5 years later. And I wanted to start with asking both of you, but maybe Mahfuz, you can start with the first one. Virgil was obsessed with the ready-made and thought about it as deeply influential on his practice across mediums. I think early in his career, when he did invoke Duchamp, there was some amount of skepticism about how he could be an inheritor of Duchamp's legacy, when in fact I think we talk a lot about how he's almost the inheritor par excellence of that legacy. Can you speak at all to that?
Yeah, I think probably V had a tendency to like sort of explore certain procedures, I guess, over very, very long periods of time, and because he sort of moved between so many different genres, the through line wasn't always recognizable. And so I think initially Duchamp himself behaved as a ready-made, right? So like initially he would just displace either the like invocation of Duchamp or an image of a work into a context that was wholly unrelated to the art world. So it would end up on a T-shirt. It would end up as a poster. It would sort of end up in a variety of different contexts. Or he'd invoke it like this, right? Conceptually, as a sort of like provocation. And then as time went on, and I think he started to design more and more objects that I think could be discussed as sculpture, potentially. I think the ready-made as a more traditional gesture became more and more important to him, and so that's when he started sampling things like from the street, like billboards. Billboards became a big thing for him. Different like objects of design and sort of augmenting them slightly as a kind of like signature. But yeah, I don't want to filibuster.
No, that was interesting. Keep going. Well, I was just thinking that, being presented with this talk with you both thinking about Virgil and conceptual art, just in case in the room, I wanted to say, the real tenet of conceptual art is to remember that the idea really holds the precedent over the final object, and to think about a practice where ideas are the practice is why things that Virgil does and did is so interesting. I mean, and where you see a lot of the crossover get to happen. So in terms of ready-mades and objects, I mean, yeah, there's something, it's like the idea is there, and then it becomes secondary and even tertiary is figuring out how best to materialize those ideas or envision those ideas. It's such a cool, conceptualism is so awesome. The idea that your practice is to think about cool shit to do and to put out in the world, and then think of the most efficient way for you as the artist to realize it. And that could be taking a urinal and putting it in there, or mashing up two different kinds of shoes and making it one because it fits the idea.
I would say just kind of as an addendum to that, I think the context was also really, really unique for him, because I would say the vast majority of his output existed in commercial spaces like fashion or like design, footwear, spaces where that kind of discourse is sort of viewed suspiciously, right? The idea that like one could have a conceptual art practice that's housed at Nike or that's housed at Louis Vuitton is sort of in itself a kind of a provocation. Because I think obviously like a museum or a gallery context, while also, being equally commercial, it's kind of taboo to invoke it, right? There's kind of a shared or a tacit understanding that this is a space in which one can behave conceptually, right? And the space can metabolize it. And so with like Nike in particular, the ready-made becomes kind of important. The pulling of kind of archival or like historical objects, writing on them, cutting them up, and so it's kind of fascinating now to see it travel full circle and see a lot of these objects sort of occupy museums now again, and the kind of.
Yeah, that's so true. I was just thinking as you were talking, conceptualism you don't think it traditionally lives in a house like Nike or Louis Vuitton, but it's only because it's maybe not as discussed or prioritized as a museum or gallery space. But that's why Virgil's practice is so interesting, because he put it to the fore. Not to say that predecessors of his and other designers don't consider themselves conceptualists or having a conceptual practice, but breaking down almost that fourth wall in a space like Nike and Louis Vuitton and making the conceptual practice. I mean, the way you guys built websites, for example, like making it apparent that there is a process to thinking through and creating webs of ideas, and that is the product. So I do think he's a groundbreaker in disappearing that illusion.
I absolutely agree. I wanted to pull up a photo of this photo became the front and back cover of a book that Virgil created with Mahfuz called Black Canon. And I think about this book a lot because, so one of the ways in which I think he's the inheritor of conceptual art is how self-reflexive he was in all of his work, how constantly, I like what you said, Ebony, that he broke the fourth wall. I think a lot of conceptual artists were metabolized back into institutions, metabolized back into established art conventions, when really the lessons from it are this sort of radical break where drawing attention to the conventions of what is or is not art, what is or is not canonical, the way he did that across his practice I always found so fascinating. So I wanted to mention this book. Mahfuz, maybe you can speak to its making a bit, but then maybe both of you guys can speak to Virgil's obsession with this idea of the canon and why he was obsessed with kind of questioning it and subverting it.
Yeah, so we were in the pandemic, I guess, and there was already kind of we had a practice of just making books. So I guess every two or 3 days, we would just compile a PDF. We would just make a book from our correspondence and the sending of images back and forth. And at the time, I think Virgil was working on his Brooklyn Museum show, and so he was thinking through, like, he was trying to think through what objects should be in the show, what it means to have them in the show, what it means to be in a museum, especially because it was the 4th or 5th iteration of the show. He was kind of saying, I went into it at first a bit naively, just kind of like, I have a show, and I'm just going to put objects in there. But he started to consider in this, I think for the first time, like, what objects ought to be in there versus ought not, and like what the line is. And so anyways, we started sending objects back and forth from just popular culture, like syrup, like
You mean scissor or
both.
like pancake syrup?
Both,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Or like a particular, I don't know, like a genre chair on one page and then a different kind of sofa on the other.
Like a sofa covered in plastic.
Exactly.
That you
Black
find at your
page,
grandmother's
white
house.
page. And we would just go through in a very, very didactic way to try and see who occupies what, and then kind of see where the points of confusion are. So like Rick Rubin, we just put him on both pages because we didn't know what to do with him.
He's white
right?
canon and
Or
black
like
canon.
Diddy, we put him on both pages, but just in different contexts
Yeah.
because we didn't know what to do with him. Or Deion Sanders was just
That
on the
is
black page.
racy.
Yeah, it was just on the black page, and then there was no one on the on the other side. So things like that. And what started as a joke became quite serious, and so yeah, that's a kind of origin story. But I'll let you intellectualize it.
I can just think about issues. I mean, there's problematics with the like language we use, this kind of lexicon for framing things and making it rigid. So this word canon has so much power over a discussion of something, especially within a museum context. I can't even imagine preparing for a show at the Brooklyn Museum or any, I mean, that's not his first show. But like, what does it mean to be a part of the canon? You know, it's kind of, if we're speaking as friends here, you know, it's kind of this like bullshit word for me as an educator too, and talking to people coming into the art world. Exercises like this would be so advantageous for anybody thinking about what their practice looks like and questioning the canon and how do you fit in it? Do you want to fit in it? Is it okay not to fit in it? Why does someone decide it's in the canon? Does it need to be written about for it to be kind of mummified and does it need to be in a textbook? Does it need to be documented in a certain way? Because there are a lot of things that don't get listed as examples when you bring up, let's say, for example, we talk about Black conceptual artists. I'm sure we're missing hundreds of them if we list them, but they haven't been canonized, which is kind of problematic. So it's interesting to again, this is the idea of his practice exposing the ideation part, right? Really considering what it means to be in the Black canon. There's no point, just really saying canons are problematic.
Yeah, 100%. In sports especially as a site for that kind of conversation. You know what I mean? Like that was a big part of it, like basketball, talking about basketball and talking about, you know, the differences in athleticism between Black and white players and like the politics around that. And like, you know, there was, Chloe and I and Virgil had what started as a plan to make a magazine, I think evolved into sort of a long form, I guess, conceptual project that ended up becoming an umbrella project that filtered down into a bunch of other spaces, I think, that we kind of worked on. And in 2016, Greg Tate and Arthur Jaffa did I think it was like Made in LA. I think it was Hamza Walker's Made in LA. They were in conversation, and AJ talked about figure skating and scoring system in figure skating. He sort of invoked Surya Bonali and the ways in which, I don't know if you guys remember, but like the backflip that she was like
The illegal backflip.
The illegal backflip as kind of symbolic of the ways in which like Black artists occupy white space. And that became sort of a running joke, like a narrative device for us. I think he has a quote that I think AJ says like something to the effect of he doesn't understand why a 360 dunk and a three-pointer, and a jump shot are both 2 points, right? He doesn't understand why there are these categories in basketball that in effect, or at one point, only black players could sort of achieve, that were scored the same as the most generic shots in the sport. And that became a device to talk about a lot of these things. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm skipping around a bit in the slideshow, but I wanted to bring up, this is one of my favorite works by V. He first installed it in his Figures of Speech show at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. And they're printouts of every single flyer of every DJ set he had done up until a certain point, where the format was always the same. He had a few simple visual rules to the flyer, and they were permuted like infinite number of times. And I think relates to his obsession with serialization, artists like Saul LeWitt, etc. And then above it would always be installed the cease and desist that he received from the United Nations, where that laundry list of lines you see is where they called out every single time he infringed on their copyright by using their logo. But I mention it because, for two reasons. I think his obsession with the canon was like ambivalent. Like, on the one hand, I think he really revered history and the need to document important practices. So he was obsessed with, that process of how something qualifies as history. And then on the other hand, I was just watching his GSD lecture before we got here. He says, it's hard for me to even call myself a designer because I didn't even think designers could look like me, right? And that's also why he's questioning the canon, this idea that the canon historically excluded stuff like this from being considered deeply conceptual, deeply artistic. I don't know. You like this work too, so.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's messy too, right? It's like ambivalent is probably the right word, right? He's on the one hand like deeply suspicious of canon formation, and also simultaneously the canon, whatever it is, whatever that thing is, like wants to be in it.
Yeah.
And that's always the weird kind of line, right? It's kind of like that one walks. But yeah, no, I love this work.
Ebony, I wanted to ask you, so you did this profile in W Magazine right before your gallery, 52 Walker open, and I feel like contextualized your practice really well in that article. Here's a quote from the article where, let me call it out. He brought up how your practice as a curator in the art world sort of bridges the gap between Black contemporary art narrowly considered, and other forms of expression that are considered outside the art world, like rap music, DJing, etc. Can you talk at all about the initial conversations you had with him about the gallery, what that opening party was like? I know he DJ'd. Just any memories you can share with the group here.
Yeah, sure. 52 Walker was an idea for a few years. I think my mic, there it is. Before I could see that it was about to become a reality, so it was really exciting. And Virgil, this is not hyperbole for a talk to say, was definitely one of the very first people to show complete blind excitement and support when it was just a concept. I hadn't even found a physical space yet. Just the announcement of it really sent me reeling, that he immediately, as I was trying to convince my colleagues and convince curators and artists why doing a show here would be phenomenal and don't worry about the blending of space, Virgil was immediately like, what can I do? Because this is awesome. And I was like, oh, really? You think it's awesome? Are you sure? He'd be like, let's do a talk. I'd be like, you want to talk to me about this space? So I always envision, for me, Virgil set the tone for me to appreciate that if someone like him can see the value of a space that it appreciates blurring lines of what is present and past, and conceptual art and material art, and fine art, subculture, street culture versus fine, high culture, and whatever that means. really gave me confidence that I didn't realize I needed until it happened. It sounds like I can't stress enough. The saddest part for me is that Virgil can't be in the space more, that I know he really put me on a path to feel confident pursuing, because he could see that he was like, this is awesome, it will work. So I had a lot of doubt before being able to talk to someone like him about it.
What are the shows you have coming up?
I have a show coming up, very exciting, in January. It's a 2-person show with Gordon Matta Clark and Pope L. An example of a show I really wish Virgil could have experienced. I think he's one of the few people who would get it right away. And then I have a wonderful painting show with Bob Thompson. My first painting show. My only painting show for a while.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it's funny that you invoked Gordon Matta Clark, another architect turned conceptual artist, among many other things. The cutouts, right? Those ended up becoming a big part of his sneaker practice. The references to sort of Gordon Matta Clark's work. Yeah, he definitely would have enjoyed that show in a full circle way. Yeah.
I mean, Virgil, also, parties are not everything, but for me, they're a huge part of my life and come up, and I know, just sharing music with V or funny memes of rappers was a lot in building and thinking through the space, and even the Instagram page of 52 Walker was a lot of that. So I just have to, just seeing Virgil on stage here, I'm getting emotional. I'm also very pregnant, so it's easy to get emotional. But he flew to New York to play this party. It was just really special.
Speaking of V as a DJ, I think when I try to think of one word in my mind that describes V, often I think of architect. I'd say DJ I think of second, as one of the fundamental frameworks that describes his practice, not just literally DJing fly parties, opening galleries in New York, DJing fly parties everywhere, but also just his approach to discipline, his approach to his work, sampling, assemblage. Mahfuz, maybe you can talk a little bit about not just his literal DJing practice, which was incredible and absolutely central, but how DJing as a framework ties him back to conceptual art, or just ties back to any of the mediums that he worked in.
Well, it's kind of funny. We used to joke a lot about relational aesthetics. Nicolas Bourriaud wrote this kind of seminal text about relational aesthetics. And he used the DJ as a device to describe a certain kind of artist that was emerging at the time. I guess Maurizio Cattelan would be one of them. I want to think about some other artists. Jeff Koons was already kind of in his pomp, but Jeff Koons was also invoked, and he used the kind of DJ and sampling as a device to talk about it, and we found
Mark
it very,
Leckey.
very... Pardon?
Mark Leckey, maybe?
Exactly. And it was funny to us because everyone that was being described was not a DJ, right? And so it was this funny way, and really had no investments in DJing culturally, right? It seemed like a great device to talk about sampling and the mixing of genres and the blending of high and low and of commercial versus obscure. And so yeah, I would say that DJing as an art form, not as an analogy, not as a metaphor, a very kind of banal, facile metaphor for sort of mixing work, was a very, very serious part of his practice, and probably the core, or the more sort of central element. He'd be DJing while working on any of a number of things, and I think he'd even build playlists or build mixes to think through things that are totally unrelated to DJing. And so the party, as you mentioned earlier, the party becomes an important thing because the party is kind of the full circle moment in which all of the different sort of disparate things that he was working on are kind of crystallized. And interestingly enough, LV, right, each one of the shows, which he took very, very seriously at LV, was numbered, and then each party was given a number with a decimal. Right. So.
And it's also such a,
Yeah.
I mean, in the context of 52 Walker, how subversive you can get with your vibe playlist set. I mean, at one point I leaned over to Virgil and I was like, David Zwerner is dancing to Wu-Tang right now in this party. Who is my boss, for anybody who doesn't know who David Zwerner is. I realize that name doesn't hold much everywhere. But, you know, plainly speaking, it's not your regular gallery after party where people are singing along, not singing, we are chanting along to Wu-Tang, and there was a mosh pit in front of Virgil's DJ booth. I mean, that was the vibe. He'd set the vibe for 52 Walker, and that was a perfect example of it. But he spent time building that list. It wasn't just I'm going to come in. He knew he had to start with a little Michael Jackson and get the white folks grooving, you know. Then he knew he could come in with something a little more pop, you know, play a little something everyone knows, maybe a Drake song, and then put on a little MF Doom for Ebony
Dilla.
And maybe some Dilla and then go another route. And it was like so calculated, but for the people he made it for, it was really felt.
You know, it's really funny. I was just thinking while we were talking about it. I think another big thing that he thought about and I think spoke about from time to time was the ways in which sort of white European club subcultures, like the Berlin scene and the Zurich scene, like sort of like Swiss border scene, Paris, London, Dublin, like these sorts of scenes have been very kind of romantically metabolized by the art world, right? Like Berlin in particular, where you can see, you know, Wolfgang Tillmans or like Alexandra Birkin or like these sort of images of nightlife and of like that kind of, and black subcultures, black urban, specifically urban subcultures, don't end up reading the same way or don't get metabolized the same way, right? And it's a challenge. It's a challenge to give that kind of like patina, that kind of, you know, like patina of romance to it. And so I think a big part of his practice as a DJ and as an artist was also like just invoking and foregrounding those subcultures. Chicago house, right? Frankie Knuckles, Larry Levant.
Right. It feels very intentional. It was very intentional on his part to cite and reference those artists within the context of a downtown art party, right? And to sort of pay homage to the influence of rap music on his practice as an artist, rap music on your practice as a curator, and on just contemporary culture in general. Like, it was always so thoughtful, as you said. It wasn't just about, it was of course about everyone turning up, but there were so many more layers and levels, I feel like, to every even like mundane decision he'd make like that.
And look at fashion when he first went into fashion as a space, right? You'd go to a fashion show and then like, I don't know, like Michel Gaubert would do the score, and then Carl Craig would do the after party. Right. You'd be like, Carl Craig is doing an after party for a you know, fashion show. You know, maybe the greatest, arguably techno DJ of all time, right? Is a line item on an after party, and someone that's laying out a generic playlist, right, does the show. And so, yeah, I think it was a really, really big part of his practice. I mean, I remember Louis Vuitton 4.
Isn't one of the first things he did, one of the first things is when the LV announcement came was hire a music director.
Absolutely.
It was, you know, I remember reading that as like the first thing wasn't maybe, I don't know the process of fashion houses, so I don't know if you're supposed to hire a second, I would think designing might be at the fore of what your next step is, but it wasn't, which is so telling.
Yeah, Benji B. Yeah, DJ Benji B.
He'll be here today at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, BBC Radio. That was the first person that he hired when he got hired at Louis Vuitton.
So this is an installation view of Virgil's first Figures of Speech show at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. In it are some paintings that reference advertising. There are some sculptures in the back that I think were deeply in dialogue with his work in graffiti. And then at the front were a series of prototypes of sneakers that he designed at Nike. There's an exhibition opening at Rubel Museum Thursday that centers Virgil's sneaker design practice at Nike. And the folks that worked on it have been thinking a lot about how Virgil's completely unique as a multidisciplinary artist in terms of sneakers being at the absolute sort of core of how he thought about all of his design and artwork. It's really cool to see this work show up in museums in this way because it was so important. Mahfuz, I wanted to ask you, since you've been working on the show and thinking about this, can you talk at all about that? Like, what sneakers were for V in general, but also just in terms of how he worked? Like, what role did they play in his practice generally?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose like the simplest answer is just like biographical. I think he always wanted to design sneakers for Nike, design Jordans, design Nikes. He grew up outside Chicago, Rockford. I think like Michael Jordan was a big part of his life. The Bulls were a big part of his life. Nike was a big part of his life. And so the answer initially is like biographical. But I suppose in another sense, certain specific sneakers became cultural. They became devices through which he could talk about art or talk about architecture or talk about some of those other themes, like the Air Force One, right, is the simplest example, right? It sort of means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts culturally, but also in terms of design, right? He would say that it behaves like a brick, right? It's like the black brick, right? Like the Carl Andre brick. It's a similar kind of logic. It's like a unit. It's a minimum unit that he can kind of build stories around, build narratives around, work on. And so I think he perpetually worked on Air Force Ones, like all the time. Even like I think Nike only has a fraction of the Air Force Ones that he actually produced one of ones. Like he would just work on them all the time by hand. He'd put flags on them. He'd put images on them. He'd change materials out. And so the Air Force One became a way of talking about the differences between high and low, right? Art students wear dirty Air Force Ones, right? Like people in the hood wear super clean Air Force Ones. You know, it just becomes like a funny thing. And so when you look at something like the Louis Vuitton Air Force One, right? There's also things like bootleg culture, real versus fake. Duchamp kind of comes back around. I'm speaking about it in a very scattered way because I think a lot of these things are really kind of just a vibe. Like I'm like hesitant to like over sort of intellectualize the role that like bootlegs play in the practice. It's kind of a vibe, right? It's kind of like you do the Louis Vuitton Air Force Ones to make the bootlegs the coolest shoes to have.
There's
right?
Also, can I just say something to you intellectualizing it? There's something powerful there in how Virgil potentially was putting it into the black canon. I mean, the bootleg is a huge part of the black canon. So I think it's really smart to mention. You don't have to pontificate too much, but it's important to, I mean, he influenced Ebo Club. I did a project of all bootlegs.
Yeah, can you talk about that? And then we'll ask one more question to end, but if you don't mind just chatting about that.
I was thinking through how important, these iconic, like you said, like having a Jordan when you're a kid, if you're especially a black kid and you, for many reasons, systemic and institutional, maybe can't afford them, but they become this marker and the sign of something that you should have, and you treat them differently than somebody who has more access to it. And then it started spilling out into a Nike logo, for example, an Adidas symbol, a Louis Vuitton, and what those symbols meant. So I commissioned 16 artists, assigned them each a brand, and had them create a bootleg of that brand. The painter Von Span actually I gave him LV, and he asked to do an LV Off-White mashup. So there's like these LV Off-White bootleg T-shirts and sweatshirts. There's a limited. It's a very limited edition.
I've got them.
Yeah, you guys have a couple.
Yeah, I've got 'em.
But it was important. It was like who says that the original has more value than something an artist had their hand in to create and pay homage to and kind of remix.
I'm going to end here with a question for Ebony, if that's okay. Ebony, you're a curator. You work on so many shows per year. You're constantly talking to the artists of our generation. Can you end with just any thought on Virgil as an artist, or Virgil as an artist within the context of all of the artists that you meet and speak with today? What kind of imprint did he leave, whether general or personally, in the communities that you're a part of?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is he seems to have, his practice has the ability, and I think will forever, to be a talking point for other artists of how you can do it. You can do things if you want, if you can ideate them. A lot of artists talk to me about that. Hearing other people, not just visual artists, but musicians and designers, thinking through a practice like Virgil's, the word cliche is wrong, but he kind of made these cliche sayings like, if you think you can do, no one's stopping you but you, or some kind of affirmation, without even trying. I mean, he just did shit. He's just like, I'm going to make this t-shirt, or I'm going to make this book. It doesn't matter if anyone sees it or if everyone sees it. And if you're doing it for the former, it's probably you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And he also had a career that showed a lot of persistence. I mean, Virgil didn't just pop onto the scene with LV, and that's, I had the opportunity to just one time be able to talk to him in my own office about that and how I felt, how it hits with me personally as a curator. A lot of people think I just popped on the scene, and that's okay. And he actually said to me, he was like, that's okay. That's how he said it. And I was like, it's fucking annoying. It's like they think I don't know what I'm doing, and I've been doing this shit for 10 years. They'll be like, it doesn't matter. Because that happened to him. He's like, you think LV is Virgil's first game? It's not. It's been a tournament for a long time, and certain people choose to pay attention when they will. And I think that's what artists can and do take from it. It's like some people will pay attention now, some people won't pay attention till later, and just keep focusing on what you want to do.
I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. I remember we were in Paris working on a project, and I was like, my confidence was really shaky, because I find myself like a bit like he did, perpetually doing things for the first time. Like every project is the first time that I've ever done the thing. And I kept saying, like, man, I don't know. And he was like, if you do 1,000 things for the first time, you've done 1,000 things, right? And he's like, so I've done 1,000 things for the first time, and so I'm better than everyone at doing things for the first time, right? And so, yeah, you
such a confidence booster. Virgil was such a confidence builder. Yeah. Seriously. How does somebody have the ability to make you feel so seen, and he's only looking at you for the first time? It's really like just heartwarming. Like everybody, you cannot feel like Virgil was not talking to you about the exact thing you were proposing for the first or 10th time. Nothing else mattered in that moment when he was talking to you. It was like, man, you really care about this weird idea that I'm putting out there? You must have 1,000,010 things to do. I'm sure your phone is vibrating off the hook while you're talking to me about this one thing. It's true. Confidence booster.
Super. Most special guy. Thank you guys all for joining us. Our next talk will be with two legendary graffiti artists, Kunle Martins and Leonard Futura McGurr. We're starting in about 10 minutes. Thank you.